Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name's Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. Really looking forward to today's event. We've got a great group of classrooms joining us from different places in Canada and the US. And I want to give a quick shout out to any classrooms who tune in via YouTube today. You can still get on the action. Use the chat sidebar on the right. Let us know where you're watching from. Send in a question or two, and we'll be sure to work some of those in. All right, really excited today to have Leon McCarron joining us. He's a writer, filmmaker, and adventurer from Northern Ireland. He has cycled 14,000 miles from New York to Hong Kong, walked the length of China, and ridden across Patagonia on horseback. His recent work has been seeking out stories of humanity in parts of the world that are often demonized or misunderstood by Western media. So to this end, he walked a 1,000-mile loop through the Holy Land from Jerusalem to Jerusalem via Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula, Palestine, and Israel, and this year has already traveled on foot in Kosovo, Armenia, Iraqi Kurdistan, and the Yemeni island of Socotra. So in search of these unique stories that he can bring back and share with people through various media. So Leon, it's always great to be stealing some of your time. We're excited to hear a little bit about your adventures. And of course, we'll turn the classrooms loose with their questions.
All right. Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to do this and to share some of my stories and adventures and the things I'm interested in. And thank you for a very kind introduction. What I'm really interested in is a number of things. I'm from Ireland originally, and I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And when I first set off to travel and have adventures, really I was looking to explore the world for myself. I just finished university, I'd finished studying, and I wanted some time to just figure out what it was I wanted to do with myself, what I might be good at, what I was not good at, what sort of things I was going to spend the following years doing. It occurred to me that although I wasn't sure exactly what type of career I wanted, I definitely didn't want to spend 40 to 50 hours a week for the next 40 to 50 years of my life doing something that I didn't enjoy and that didn't seem worthwhile. So I started going off on these adventures, and I went on a long cycling trip, saw a lot of the world. But I realized that the more interesting things were not necessarily just how it made me feel or that selfish side of it. Much more interesting was the access that I could get by being on a bicycle or being on foot, and the sorts of parts of the world that I would end up in and things that I would see. And so that led me to the idea that perhaps storytelling might be a way in which I could combine these interests I had, but also develop skills, learn to take better pictures, make videos, write, try and communicate these discoveries as best I possibly could. And so that's led 10 years, tens of thousands of miles of human-powered travel in around about 100 countries. I've written a couple of books, made a few independent films, and a couple of TV shows as well. And it's been a lot of fun. And I suppose what I want to talk about briefly with you all today is firstly just this idea of adventure and what it is and why it's important, and what we all might think the point and purpose of adventures are. But I also want to, I guess, zone in a little bit on a part of the world that I'm really passionate about, which is the Middle East. And it's a part of the world that is not often talked about in very positive terms, let's say. A lot of what we might hear on the news and the mass media is generally a lot of the really negative stuff. We hear about the perpetual conflicts, we hear about the dangers, we hear all that stuff over and over again. I've been very fortunate to spend quite a lot of time in the region, and what I've discovered, of course, is that the vast majority of people there are good and kind, as you might expect, but also that there's so much more there, and I think it's an incredibly misunderstood place. And I hope that by delving a little bit deeper, I can discover and also help others see why it's important that we don't demonize parts of the world like that, why it's important that we help look for similarities and look for ways in which we're more alike than we are different. So I'll share with you some pictures now, and show you some of the adventures I've been on in the Middle East over the last 6 or 7 years. So here we go. So this this picture is this was my first big expedition into the Middle East. This was on the Arabian Peninsula. It's a desert called the Empty Quarter. It's the largest sand desert on Earth. And my friend Alistair, who's in the front there looking like he's working very hard, him and I walked 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers across this desert in the footsteps of a British traveler who'd been there 70 years before. And we were looking at how the desert had changed. And as you can see, we had this pretty ropey homemade cart that we dragged along over food and water and supplies on. After that, I went to Iran and followed the longest river in Iran from source to sea over the course of about 6 weeks with another adventurer called Tom Allen. That's him in his packraft, which is a inflatable kayak, essentially, going down this river called the Karun. One of my more recent journeys in the Middle East has been to an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean called Socotra. And I think you heard it mentioned briefly at the start, but it's a really incredible place. It belongs to Yemen, although it's a few hundred miles south of the coast of Yemen. It's actually closer to Somalia. It's between the two, between Yemen and Somalia. So it's not exactly the sort of place that's a real tourist hotspot, as you can imagine, but it is safe. It's avoided the brutal and very sad conflict that's taking place in Yemen at the minute. And it's also one of the most incredibly biodiverse places on Earth. There are huge numbers of endemic species on the island. That is, species of plants and animals that are found nowhere else on Earth. For that reason, it's sometimes called the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, because it shares similarities to the Galapagos Islands in that sense. This is a picture of probably what's known as the flagship species of the island, the dragon's blood tree, which is, again, found nowhere else. It's got this very strange looking shape, almost like an upturned umbrella. And if you were to cut it open, cut through the bark, you would find that the sap, the resin inside, is a deep red color, a deep crimson. So it almost looks like it's bleeding when the sap comes out. And that's used for a number of things, medicine and cosmetics and so on. And a small team of us went last year to the island, and we're hoping to go back and explore more. So these are some of the more recent and more, I guess, lengthy journeys I've made. But what I was also going to tell you a little bit about was probably the longest journey I've made, the longest continuous journey, which was a walk for about 6 months, 5 to 6 months of 1,000 miles or so through an area that we sometimes call the Holy Land. The area around Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jericho, Nazareth, all these names that even in Ireland I grew up being very familiar with, but had never been to see. And it's also one of the, in modern day sense, one of the most complicated land spaces on Earth. And so I wanted to see if it was possible to still go and do something very simple like walk through all of these complex places. And also to see, and you'll see on this map that a lot of the country names are taken out. This is more or less the route that I took. The reason behind this was I wondered if I could just simplify this whole thing and look at the journey instead of moving from complicated land space to complicated land space, if I could just move simply from person to person or conversation to conversation or story to story, and see if that somehow connected a place that is often seen in very different terms. So I began in Jerusalem, often thought to be the holiest city in the world, home to the 3 Abrahamic faiths, and walked out into the countryside, this is the West Bank, beautiful olive groves and terraces looking across to Jordan, and just an incredible array of landscapes. This is a valley called Wadi Kelt, which has got a 6th century monastery hanging off the side of the cliff, and you feel these layers of history and culture and faith as you walk out, and it's very quiet, very peaceful, and I would argue very beautiful as well. I walked with my friend Dave. There's the two of us looking a little silly, but what was interesting to us was that to walk here was very natural. People have always walked in this part of the world for many thousands of years. All the old trade routes came through here. Pilgrims have walked through here. Bedouin, the local nomads, the shepherds walk, and there's now even contemporary modern day hiking trails being built in the region. So it's a landscape that's been carved by footsteps, and as you walk you see all of these different parts of history that have at one point or another been a major influence in the area. These are Roman columns. This was once one of the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire. And it's important as well, I think, to notice how diverse it is. Sometimes it's easy for us to generalize big areas of the world, and some people might think the Middle East is mostly desert and beige colors, and of course that's not really true. There's huge variety, and this is northern Jordan, where of course it's very green and fertile for much of the year, but there is a clear demarcation or changing point as well, where that greenery gives way on a watershed, and south leads to the desert. And as I walked south through Jordan, I came through these huge valleys, some of which are about a vertical kilometer deep. This area, it might not surprise you to know, is often called the Grand Canyon of the Middle East, because of its similarities. It's a really stunning place, and there are some huge empty landscapes there. It's a wonderful place for adventure, although I must say it's also quite a hard place to be walking with all of your gear on your back. I had to carry all of my water and be very, very careful not to run out, because there might not be too many people around that would be able to help me in some of those more remote areas. But there have always been people who've lived here, even in the deepest parts of the desert. And those people who've lived there have often had to be very clever about how they manage their surroundings. And there are some very wonderful and famous examples of that. The most famous of all, I suppose, in this whole region is probably seen in the ruins of the ancient city of Petra, which is in southern Jordan. And this was a city that was built, carved into the sandstone, carved out of rock 2,000 years ago by a civilization called the Nabateans. And they built it to impress travelers who would come through on the trade routes that passed by. And I think you'll agree, 2 millennia on, it's just as impressive now as it was back then. The end of that journey took me through these big deserts in southern Jordan called Wadi Rum, which is also become very well known now as a location for Hollywood movie shoots. It's seen as one of the landscapes on Earth that's most similar to that of Mars. So they often send film crews down there to try and get this otherworldly feel. And then I crossed Sinai to get to this mountain in the background, which is Mount Sinai, which is where Moses is said to have received the 10 Commandments from God. So there's a lot of incredible landscapes. But what always strikes me about journeys like this is that by far the biggest factor, which is maybe not a surprise, is the human interaction. Landscapes are beautiful. They're very impactful in a certain way, but the way in which I'm received in a place, the conversations I have, that feels to me a much deeper experience and much more telling. And through that, I guess I was able to see that, yes, this area can be volatile. There are heavy police, military presence in certain areas, particularly in places like Jerusalem, which is where one of the only places where Israelis and Palestinians might find themselves side by side. But more often than not, I would see ways in which this land was connected religiously and ethnically. This is a picture from Jordan, where so often in the small villages, churches and mosques are built side by side. To show very obviously that cooperation coming together. And I'm happy to report that, having walked around the Holy Land, I was welcomed into churches, mosques, and synagogues, given places to sleep, given food, so much food actually on this journey, and endlessly looked after. And we don't have a huge amount of time for it, but I'll just tell one story, which is one of my favorites of this man, who you can see. This is Mahmoud on the left. And after a very long day of walking in Jordan, just the sun was setting. I was passing by his house, and he came out and saw me there, and really just came over to me and said, come in, you silly foreign person, and let me look after you, and whisked me into his home, made some food for me, made a bed in his living room area that I could spend the night on. And once all that was done, then he asked me who I was and why I was walking through Jordan with this big backpack. And when I told him about this journey I was on, he said something really remarkable. He said, your feet must be so sore from so much walking. I wonder if you would allow my sons and I to wash them to ease the pain of all of this, which is, that's a crazy thing to do for anyone, let alone for a total stranger. And I was really worried. I'd walked for 3 months at this point. My feet were toxic. I was worried the smell of them might kill this poor kind stranger, but anyway, insisted, and took off my boots and socks and washed my feet. And what an amazing thing to do. And so that, I think, epitomizes and sums up what I'm trying to say here, that these are experiences that I'm very privileged to have been part of, but also very proud, and I also see it as a responsibility to share these. This is what defines a country like Jordan, and even a wider region, to me, when I think about it. So I'll wrap up there, and take some more questions. I guess I would say that as I am moving forward in what I'm trying to do with all of this, I'm really interested in the frontier of adventure these days. And I do think there's a growing culture of fear in the world, where it's very easy for us to be afraid of places and people that we don't know or don't understand. And I think one of the purposes of expeditions these days and explorers is to try and redress that balance, and try and make the world feel a little bit more connected again, and celebrate some of those things. So let me bring myself back here, and I hope that's a very quick whirlwind tour of a lot of parts of the Middle East, but I hope you enjoyed it, and fire away. I will be happy to take absolutely any questions, sensible ones first, and then we'll move our way down the list.
All right. That's awesome, Leon. Thanks so much for sharing that. I love hearing your stories. I've been able to watch a few of the films that you've made from some of the adventures, and it always what always sticks out for me is how you share the history, you show these amazing landscapes, and most of all the people, and how generous people are, how misunderstood, and how we see this tiny little piece of these countries when there's so much more to them, and there's so many more layers and so many amazing things happening there. So thank you for bringing those stories to the light, because a lot of people aren't.
Sure, thank you.
All right, well, let's get meeting some classrooms. Let's see. Let's go to Charlotte, North Carolina first. We've got some students, middle school students, hanging out with Mrs. McLaughlin. Let me get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, North Carolina?
Doing great. Just had a question. Come here.
What was your favorite moment in the whole thing?
My favorite moment in the whole thing. That's a good question. My favorite moment in the whole thing. That's as you can imagine, that's a very hard decision to try and make. But it was possibly, it's probably one of the acts of hospitality. I have a really strong memory of a night in Iran when my friend Tom and I were caught in a snow blizzard, which might seem unusual, but high up in the mountains in Iran, it can get very cold, very snowy, and we were desperately trying to find somewhere to put our tent. We knew there was wolves around. We were starting to get quite scared, and out of nowhere, a farmer turned up and took us to his very nice, warm farmhouse to spend the night. and looked after us really well. And I've never been so grateful to not have to spend time in my tent with wolves around.
All right. No, those are great stories. And I think, yeah, you wouldn't find that as much here. If, I'm close to Toronto, if I were walking through Toronto, I just don't think you'd find people would open up their homes as easily in that same way. But that's something that's, anytime you talk to somebody who explores or experiences those regions, can share stories like that, how quickly they can arrive somewhere and have a place to stay with a family in a moment, just open up their homes. It's pretty awesome.
Sure, yeah. Although I think one thing that's also interesting to me is the first thing I did was I rode a bicycle across North America when I was 23. Set off from New York City, rode up to Toronto, came back down into the US in Michigan, and then across and so on. And even then, I was welcomed into a lot of the homes of strangers. People would let me put up my tent in the backyard. They would give me water. They would look after me. And I think that kindness towards strangers is something that's inbuilt within people. And yes, we have to be careful and wary too, and rely on good sense. But yeah, I find that even in North America, people are very open towards me.
All right, let's jump to another classroom. Let's go to Toronto, Ontario this time. We've got Mrs. Woods, grade 5-6 is hanging out with us. So let's get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, Toronto?
What was your favorite food you had when you were walking?
My favorite food. Wow, I mean, that's a good one. There's so I mean, when you're walking, all food is good, right? But food all across the Middle East is just amazing. But I have to say, I mean, it's a probably a bit of a dodge of an answer, or maybe too obvious a one, but good hummus is just the best thing ever, especially when you've been walking for 5 or 6 hours. Just fresh baked bread and good hummus, that really makes a day.
Yeah, I imagine the flavors, the spices, it's just probably a sensory overload sometimes.
It is, absolutely, yeah.
All right, let's see. Let's go to Newmarket, Alabama. Mrs. Moore's grade 5s are hanging out with us. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, grade 5s?
Hi. All right, Gracie, go ahead.
How many languages do you speak?
How many languages do I speak? Well, I guess I'm not fluent in any other language other than English, but when I've learned some Arabic for when I've been passing through these regions in particular. I learned a little bit of Mandarin for when I was walking in China in the past, and I can speak a little bit of French and Spanish, but I'm not. Languages I would classify more as a weakness for myself. I wish I could speak a lot more, and I think it's interesting that it's still possible to go and do these things without being a languages expert. I often just make sure I find someone else to travel with me who's much better.
All right, great question. Mrs. Elliott's class, 7th graders hanging out in Dallas. Let's get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, Dallas?
Good. How did you use the lessons about connection abroad back at your home?
How did I missed the end of that. How did I use the lessons about connection?
How did you use the lessons you learned about connections abroad when you went back home?
Oh, great question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm speaking to you right now from London, in the UK, and this is it's a big city. There's 8 million people here, and I find it very easy to do the same thing that everyone else does, which is just to move around the city full speed, not talk to anyone, and just focus on my own story, focus on my own life. But when I go away on these journeys and I see this kindness towards me, I see the way in which other parts of the world are much more community focused. It does encourage me to try and be better at that when I come back here. And I think it's still a work in progress, but I try and remind myself of the sorts of kindnesses I've seen and implement those if I get a chance to. If it's something as simple as having a conversation with someone who looks lost, or just trying to be a little bit more open and inquisitive in everyday life. But I think there's a lot of there's an implication sometimes that we live in these big cities, and so therefore everything's fine here. You know, we're doing it right. We've got everything sorted. But I don't think that's necessarily true. A lot of rural areas around the world are sometimes much better set up than big megacities. So I'm still trying to figure all that out.
All right, another good question. So before we do one more swing through our camera classrooms, I do have a question that just came in on YouTube, and kind of goes with what you, a little bit in line with what you were just saying. And they're wondering if you've ever had times, say out in the desert, where you've just been straight lost.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, these days less so, because I think I'm just a little bit better at navigating. But certainly when I started traveling, I got lost quite a lot, and I would just try and always make sure that I knew where the next area was that I could get essentials like water and food, and that I would never be too far away that I would run out completely. But I mean, even riding my bike across North America, I got lost quite a lot. I ended up in an entirely different American state than I planned to be. I ended up riding through Iowa on my way across, and I was always meant to be further north than that. So that maybe gives you an example of how bad I was at 23.
All right. Well, we got some high schoolers with Mr. Duggan in Toronto, Ontario. Let's get their microphone turned on. How we doing, Toronto?
Good.
All right, who's up?
What's the scariest place you've ever been to?
You're gonna
You've never been to?
Scariest place?
Yeah.
The question? Yeah. Scariest place I've ever been to? Gosh, I don't know. I mean, probably scary in sort of natural world way was I made a film last year about the Arctic, and I went up to an archipelago of islands called Svalbard, which are north of Norway, in the Arctic Circle, and we were on a boat shooting this film, and it's all really beautiful, you know, clear blue skies, snowy mountains on the land, everything was awesome. And then really quickly this storm came in, and just the seas became super choppy, sky went black, and you know, you're on this tiny little boat bouncing around, and it changed within the space of like an hour. And that's one of the kind of craziest examples to me of how impressive nature can be, and it's pretty terrifying when you're fully reliant on that as the only thing that will keep you alive.
All right, let's see. Let's start swinging through again. Let's go back to our group in North Carolina. I'm going to turn your microphone on if you guys have another question for Leon.
Did you ever want to quit and go home?
Yeah, I did actually. I wish that wasn't the case, but quite a lot. I mean, I think one of the things about doing journeys like this is you often feel, you get the extremes of emotion, right? You feel happier than ever when things go well. It's really easy to feel very sad if you're on your own and things are tough. And so, you know, on all the journeys I've done, I've always wondered what it would be like if I could just give up and head home. But what I always remind myself is straight away it would be easier. I'd be really grateful just to go home and lie in bed and eat ice cream and, you know, see my friends. But I know that I would also really regret it after a week or 2 weeks. I would give up on this amazing opportunity to see an incredible part of the world just because I was feeling a bit grumpy or my legs hurt or whatever.
All right. I totally understand why you might have those feelings, and I think it would be far worse to regret afterwards, I think, than any hardship. All right. Mrs. Moore's class in Alabama, let's get your microphone back on.
He's welcome to come. All right, Malachi.
Have you ever been to the South?
Of the United States, the American South.
The American South. Yeah, I have. I was there over the winter for a few months, and I rode the train, actually. I rode the train from New Orleans to Los Angeles across the Southwest, and was making a film about that. It was my first time to visit a lot of those states in the Southwest. And then I also then rode my bike through some of the southern states, heading the other direction, heading east. And I loved it. I'm really keen to go back.
All right. Well, maybe we'll have to connect you with that class and give you some pointers for exploring Alabama.
Yeah, no kidding.
All right. Mrs. Woods group, let's get your microphone back on in Toronto.
Have you ever been in the Dead Sea?
Yeah, I have. I've been in the Dead Sea a couple of times. I've been in the Dead Sea on the Israeli side and also on the Jordanian side. And it's a really crazy experience because, as you probably know, it's the lowest point on Earth, and it's also the levels of salt in the Dead Sea are something like, they're much, much higher than a regular ocean, something like 9 times as high. So you float, you just can't sink, and you can lie there and read a book and just float around all day. It's kind of fun. But then you get out and this salt immediately crystallizes, so you got to wash it off straight away.
All right. Texas, Mrs. Elliott's class, your microphone is on.
How do you go about planning your route, and what all goes into your decision making?
Cool, good question. Thank you. Often I'll just try and plan the way that I go based on what are the things I would like to see, what sort of landscapes would I like to pass through, where are there communities that I might want to visit, but I don't plan it too firmly. I'll often have one place here that I'll start at, another place maybe 100 miles away that I want to get to, and in between I like to try and be reasonably flexible so I can ask people along the way what's best. And then sometimes, I mean, on some of this journey through the Holy Land area, I was actually following the paths for new hiking trails. So someone else has been there and determined what might be a good way to go. So that's a good guide to follow as well. And the decision making, I always just think, what's going to make the most interesting experience and story? How am I going to find something that I can then communicate to other people that will teach them something and teach myself something? And whatever seems to be the most promising for that, that's the way that I'll go.
All right, excellent question. Where do we need to go? Mr. Duggan's class, your microphone's on again.
Do you have any tips for people that kind of don't want to start backpacking and they go into the unknown?
So I think that was any tips for going backpacking into the unknown. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's first thing to do is just get started. Start with something reasonably small, but just go. It took me such a long time to realize that. I was planning this big bike trip, and the all of the things I didn't know just felt really paralyzing, and it took me, like a year or two longer than I wanted it to before I even set off. So it's really important just to find some time and go and do something straight away. Have a first experience. Plan something pretty small. Don't plan like a 2-week-long wilderness hike if you've never done it before. Go out for a weekend or a couple days with some other people. Never really go alone to start off with. Have someone else. Ideally, have people who've got a little bit more knowledge, and find a place that really seems like it's going to throw some challenges at you. That's part of the fun is overcoming these challenges, learning how you react in these scenarios, and pushing yourself a little bit each time, a little bit more. And I'm sure there's plenty of places close to you that you could do that.
All right, great question and really good points. You talked about your trip across the empty quarter. You were with Alistair on that one, and he's a huge proponent of the micro adventure. So it doesn't always have to be this huge, expensive to the other side of the world. Sometimes just exploring a new part of your own community that you've never been in can be the adventure, or throwing your sleeping bag on a hill somewhere. So those little adventures can be pretty rewarding and pretty exciting. All right. Well, Leon, before we wrap up today, I did want to ask about one more journey. Patagonia is a place that has always fascinated me. It looks so huge and beautiful. And how did you end up horseback riding across Patagonia?
Yeah, that's one of my favorites, I guess. That was a few years ago, and I heard it's probably a good example as well of maybe my decision-making process for planning trips, because I think a lot of us would love to go and ride a horse across Argentine Patagonia, right? It just sounds cool. But I also wanted to make sure that if I was going to do something like that, it had a real purpose. And there is a river called the Rio Santa Cruz, which flows across Patagonia, comes from the glaciers, flows down into the Atlantic on the eastern coast. And it's the last large free-flowing glacial river in Argentine Patagonia. And when I was reading about it, I was reading about some of the old explorers who'd been there, and I discovered that within a couple of months of that point where I was reading about it, there was 2 huge dams that were planned to be built upon it, and would flood about half of the surface area of the valley, and would destroy the entire ecosystem. So very quickly, I found a couple of friends and rallied some support, and went out, bought some horses, and started to ride down the length of this river valley just to document it, maybe for the last time before these dams were built. So we did that on a real budget as well, just get up and go. And a few weeks later, arrived at the far side and had this footage of the river valley before the dams were built.
Now, is that a place you might want to visit again in the future to kind of see how it's changed, or maybe not, because you remember it in this beautiful, pristine way before the change?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. I think I would love to go back. I will go back, I hope. But I think it's important for us to go and see these things, even if it's difficult, to watch somewhere pristine that's been in many ways destroyed, because it's what's happening across so much of our planet right now. We're losing a lot of these battles, and it's very important to take note where we have failed and try and do better next time as a species.
All right. Well, Leon, again, thank you so much for letting us steal some time. You're a phenomenal storyteller, and your movies and your book are great. Where can classrooms go if they want to maybe find some of those to check out, or follow along with some of your upcoming adventures? What's the best place they should head to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff online. My website is a good hub for it, which is just my name, leonmccarron.com, and all the links to everything else are on there.
Perfect. All right. Well, boys and girls, thank you so much, as always, for your awesome questions. I'm sure if more came up, you could always fire them Leon's direction via social media. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer some of those. Last thing we'll do today before we sign off, Leon, is I'll turn all the classrooms' mics on, let them say goodbye and thank you. But again, thanks so much for your time. We look forward to seeing what comes next. So here we go, boys and girls.
Bye.
On.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.